What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? Project Sunshine, where the US government bought remains of dead infants to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral because doctors had removed her legs and didn't want her to find out. Is anyone else ridiculously disturbed that they named that Project Sunshine? What the duck? The German radar guidance system Unwritten was a great example on why your project/operation names should have nothing to do with their content. LE5. During WW2 the British gained some intelligence referring to a new radar system called Gerald, also known as Unwritten. Unwritten being a single-eyed mythical god, engineers were able to figure out what the system was and how it worked, based on it using a single beam, one eye. Jeffrey Dahmer's full confession, a couple of 100 pages of pure madness. Necrophilia, dismemberment, skinning, lobotomy, body part preservation, cannibalism. Dahmer became pretty close to his interrogating detectives, Dennis Murphy and Patrick Kennedy, and provided a lot of detail to them. A lot of it in a pretty candid, offhand manner. Dahmer should have been prosecuted for what he did in the army. Source: for capture it began the day he and Dahmer, an army medic, were put into a room together. The assaults began at once, and, eventually, he leapt from the third floor window to escape. I had probably been raped 8 to 10 times, I don't know. He was tying me to the bunk with motor pull rope. He took all my clothing from me. He would either beat me before he raped me, or he would beat me after. I had no idea that he did while in the army. The most horrifying thing is that he was never punished for it, and that this monster ruined so many people before he started his rampage of destroying men. What a horrible human. After the My Lai massacre, killing of around 400 to 500 innocent civilians in Vietnam after an army troop killed an entire village, the US government established a group to investigate other war crimes like this occurring in Vietnam, the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group. They found 28 massacres of equal or greater magnitude than My Lai that the public was unaware of, so literally thousands of innocent people killed by U.S. soldiers. The information has since been reclassified, but there were several journal articles on it when it was first released. I took a military ethics class hosted by a prof who spent many years in Vietnam as a Marine captain. He personally experienced a colonel who operated with a doctrine called count the meat. Basically, the success of an operation was dependent upon how many bodies it made. The presumption was that they were all enemies. CIA involvement in starting the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted 36 years and led to the genocide of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people. Hoopsie daisy. And set up the country for the shit show that is Guatemala today. Just like Nicaragua. Guatemala is a beautiful country and the people are also beautiful, but, as one taxi driver said to me, 25 families own everything in the country. Corruption is rife and the destabilization caused by the involvement of the US has been devastating for the country and its people. I watched from my hotel balcony as people came to the lake to bathe and wash their clothes. One US bomber accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb a short distance from a major US city, can't remember which, but luckily it didn't detonate. Off the coast of Georgia. They still haven't found it. My hometown was littered with radioactive waste by the federal government as part of the Manhattan Project. Then we wonder why cancer and thyroid conditions are the norm. I grew up 2 miles from the Lake Ontario Ordnance Works site, and my dad grew up on 89th Street in Niagara Falls in the 40s. He says that he remembers sitting on the train tracks as a kid watching the hooker chemical trucks bringing 55-gallon drums to the Love Canal. That whole area was contaminated with all sorts of nasty stuff. So what did they do? They bulldozed it over and built houses on it, of course. Then in the 70s, when people were noticing toxic sludge in their basements, kids' feet were being literally burned by the high levels of phosphorus in the ground, and people were getting sick. They acted like they knew nothing. Eventually people sued, and the whole area was evacuated. They tried to clean it up, but they basically put tons of dirt and clay over the area as a cap, and it's all fenced off. You can see it when you drive east on the Niagara Falls Expressway to Towanda. for the Lewiston storage site, also known as the NFSS Niagara Falls storage site. I've read documents where they had hazardous storage barrels sitting exposed to the element, with seepage and all that. Again, they've covered everything with clay to stop it, but it's already in the ground. The bad thing is that there's a large elementary and high school, Lewiston Porter, about 2 miles from the site, which is actually on property that used to be part of the site, but was never used, and was sold to the county. Needless to say, the cancer rate among long-term staff and teachers is higher than average. I'm glad to have finally moved away. The Department of Health and Human Services practiced female sterilization on Native American women all the way through the 1970s. Kinda sobering knowing that we were using tax dollars to suppress indigenous birth rates less than 50 years ago. I think even recently in Manitoba there's been reports of hospital staff telling local indigenous women who'd just given birth that they aren't allowed to see their babies unless they consent to sterilization. First Nations are still incredibly vulnerable, and the West is still feeling aftershocks of genocide. This was so prevalent that between 25–50% of Native women were sterilized against their will, and their birth rate dropped by 3/4 following this time. Black and poor women too. I remember reading a story about a 12-year-old black girl in the South in the 60s going to the doctor for an appendectomy and leaving sterilized without being told. Many didn't find out for years until they realized they should gotten their period by now or were having trouble conceiving. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. Suspiciously, she always has a headache when I propose having X. Possible capitalist plot. CIA invested millions in trying to make cat spies. $20 million to be precise. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against US civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. My high school English teacher mandated that I read this. I didn't understand it at the time, but he was responding to my question I posed him. As an airborne vet, why do you seem so jaded in regards to US history and politics? Still one of my favorite teachers to this day. He and I were able to go into all at other things the US has done. As a part of the Army and CIA's experiments into mind control, they put electrodes into the pleasure centers of dogs' brains. Initially, they wanted hundreds of dogs. They only actually got 10, and of those only a few were implanted. The ones which would be remote controlled by zapping them and essentially giving them a dose of dopamine when they were facing the right direction. The controllers would stop the dope zap when they wanted the dogs to stop, and then the dogs would reorient themselves until they were facing the correct direction. This meant when the controllers weren't present, the dogs who had been implanted would continually spin in circles, even in their cages, always looking for the direction that gave them that next hit. The program ran out of funding in the mid-60s, and the dogs were destroyed. If you want to read all about it and other things that the US and governments around the world are up to from the horse's mouth, I highly recommend theblackvault.com, the website of /u/blackvault. Here's 100-ish pages of what I described above, helpfully foiled and archived thanks to his hard work. Edit for some bright side. Via the same source we get remote control of war dogs, remotely controlled scout dog, June 1974, wherein we learn that we can just train dogs. They respond to audio and visual cues and can be trained to turn on command at long distances by playing a tone over the radio. When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all of the astronauts survived the initial explosion, as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. We looked at this in flight school and pretty much, there's evidence to support that the crew was still running their procedures. Even after it was obvious shit hit the fan, they didn't die accepting their fate. They died astronauts. That's something to be admired, AMO. Not declassified documents, but the discovery of the Tuskegee syphilis study on unwitting black American males was pretty ducking horrific. The study was conducted without the benefit of patients' informed consent. The men were told that the study was only going to last 6 months, but it actually lasted 40 years. After funding for treatment was lost, the study was continued without informing the men that they would never be treated. None of the men infected were ever told that they had the disease, and none were treated with penicillin even after the antibiotic was proven to successfully treat syphilis. According to the Centers for Disease Control, the men were told that they were being treated for bad blood, a colloquialism that described various conditions such as syphilis, anemia, and fatigue. Bad blood, specifically the collection of illnesses the term included, was a leading cause of death within the Southern African American community. New Zealand's UFO files are a bit creepy. I was in the library and stumbled across the bound files. There's a lot of assumed crazy people being crazy, but there's also one specific one that stood out from respectable Air Force pilots who were both in the air, conducted many tests, for instance blinking, moving the plane in relation to the object, verifying what he saw with the co-pilot to ensure it wasn't an illusion or his mind. I don't know, just the fact that you'd assume he wasn't crazy creeps me out so much. NZ is not real. 2 things come to mind. I think they're called the Pentagon Papers. They detail how America went into Vietnam with no intention of winning, rather to control China in that part of the world. Not creepy, but potentially creepy as the JFK assassination papers that get released in October. I'm looking forward to that day. Edit. Spelling. Holy hit. I didn't know they were releasing his documents. I can't wait. Surprised no one has mentioned the Panama Papers. They've been out for a while, but there's been little coverage of them. TLDR of them, lots of money laundering that was tracked pointed to major governments and global businesses. Edit. Amazon Prime has a series called The Giant Beast that is the global economy. They talk about the Panama Papers in a couple episodes. Also Paradise Papers, the elite of this world money laundering and essentially hoarding wealth. I wonder why the media coverage was super slim. Can't remember the source, but apparently there is a legit order signed by Hitler to his nuclear researchers saying, if they have a viable nuclear explosive, start loading into V2s immediately. However, Germans didn't come that close to making a nuclear bomb. They didn't consider it a priority because they calculated that it wouldn't be a decisive weapon to win the war, especially against US, who would already have nuclear bombs in their arsenal. Estimates put the probable year for a German nuke, if the efforts continued, around 1947. One that is not US. There was an episode of Radiolab that talks about an enormous secret facility in Britain that houses the British Empire's secret archives. The way they described it, it sounds like the place where the Ark of the Covenant is stored at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. What they uncover in the episode is the human rights atrocities that were committed by British troops during the MAU uprising in Kenya during the 1950s. There were details in the uncovered documents about detention camps and torture that occurred during the conflict. It gave grounds for surviving MAU to seek compensation against the Crown in recent years. The atrocities of the conflict were not widely known about until recently. I don't think it's classified, but Project Thor, using a satellite bomber to bomb a city. Imagine a missile or a bomb coming from space, and before you know it, your city is destroyed by a falling missile/bomb. It was called rods from God. Basically it would have used kinetic energy, no explosives. It would have used a series of 2,000-pound tungsten rods to destroy and vaporize without the radiation of a nuclear bomb. It was only avoided because we signed treaties with the Russians not to weaponize space.